Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Cambridge City Council's Planning and Transport Scrutiny Committee meeting. This includes members here in the chamber and those attending virtually, and those members of the public who are watching the live stream via the Council's YouTube channel. My name's Councillor Simon Smith, and I'm the chair of this committee meeting. Please can those present in the chamber note that everything on your desk, including your laptop screen, could be broadcast at some point. If you're following the Teams meeting here in the chamber, on your laptop, your audio, microphone and camera must be switched off. The camera follows the microphone being switched on, so those in the chamber are requested to wait a couple of seconds before speaking to allow the camera to catch up. If the fire alarm sounds, please follow officers who will leave the chamber and make your way down the stairs to the assembly point. Please do not use the lift. Please can those participating in the team meeting indicate if you wish to speak via the chat column. Please do not use the chat column for any other purpose. Please ensure that you've switched off or silenced any other devices so that you do not interrupt the proceedings. When you're invited to address the meeting, please make sure your microphone is switched on. When you finish addressing the meeting, please turn off your microphone immediately. Speak slowly and clearly, and please do not talk over or interrupt anyone. I'll now roll call councillors alphabetically by surname so the public can see who they are. Please advise if you know or any apologies from other councillors when I ask you to speak. Are you present, Councillor Bajent? Councillor Bick?
Yes, I am.
That's the right way to do it, Dave. Councillor Davies?
Good evening, Chair.
Okay. Councillor Herbert?
Good evening, Chair.
Councillor Pora?
Present, Chair.
Councillor Scott?
Yes, present, Chair.
Is online. Councillor Smart?
Present.
And Councillor Swift?
Present, Chair.
Thank you. We're also joined by Executive Councillor for Planning Policy and Infrastructure, Councillor Thornborough.
Present, Chair.
Thank you. The officers permanently at table for this meeting are Joint Director for Planning and Economic Development, Stephen Kelly. Good evening. Committee Manager, Claire Tunnicliffe.
Good evening.
Meeting Producer, Chris Connor. The committee will receive a presentation from the Joint Director of Planning and Economic Development. Members of the committee will then discuss the report and vote on the recommendations. As chair, if the vote is split, I will have the casting vote. Following the vote of the committee, the Executive Council will be asked if they are minded to agree the decision. Apologies has been covered. Have I missed anybody? No? Moving on to agenda item 2, could committee members please declare if they have any declarations of interest and identify which agenda item their declaration relates to. Councillor Bajent.
Member of the Cambridge Cycling Campaign, Chair.
Agenda item 3. Now we've got the minutes of the 26th of May and the 28th of June. These have been submitted for approval. If there are any concerns or members feel that they need more time to read through the June minutes, as these are circulated by email only, could you please let me know? Otherwise, they'll be both approved as a correct record. So is everybody happy for us to look at the minutes 26th of May and 28th of June? Okay. Are there any matters arising from the 26th of May minutes? So those can be approved. And any matters arising from the 28th of June minutes. So those can be approved. So under agenda item 4, we have no public speakers, so we'll move to item 5. Item 5 is officer delegations for infrastructure projects. For this item, we're joined by the Joint Director of Planning and Economic Development to present this item. So Stephen, if you could introduce it, please.
Thank you and good evening. I'm just going to share my screen because this this item relates to a request to confirm arrangements for. Hopefully people can see that. Good. To confirm arrangements for dealing with anticipated forthcoming major development proposals that are submitted either through the nationally significant infrastructure project process, which involves a development consent order, or through the Transport and Works Act. And as the report tries to highlight, the reason for seeking delegation from the council, or confirming the delegation from the council to officers, is to ensure effective representation of the service, of the council at the examination phase, particularly of these projects. There's a very well-worn path in which officers represent the council's interests in the case of planning appeals or planning applications, in part because the planning application process is both clearly set out through the council's constitution and delegations to officers provided accordingly. In some respects, Greater Cambridge isn't used to the number and quantum of infrastructure schemes coming forward all at once, and unsurprisingly, therefore, the systems and constitutional provisions set out how officers represent the council are not as clear-cut, and hence the aspiration in this case to get greater clarity to sit alongside effective representation of the council's case. But I'll run through a few slides because I hope, I think in parallel with the report, hopefully the process and the recommendation will become clearer. So hopefully people can see that. There are two processes, as I've said. One is the Transport and Works Act process for the consenting of development, and the other is the nationally significant infrastructure project development consent order process. The Transport and Works Act process has, broadly speaking, these 6 stages to it, defined in the processes and regulations, and at times requiring very short response periods. What I've highlighted against this slide in yellow is, I suppose, the seven processes that I'm outlining here. The first process, very much in the case of a planning appeal. Oops, hang on a second. I don't know what's happened there. Is that's not my screen? The first of those is the item, the element that is not delegated, that in paragraph 418 of the report is a matter which would be determined by the council, by this committee, in terms of the council's position in respect of each of the proposals. Those other elements, which are not dissimilar to those that take place through a planning appeal, are matters that I'm seeking your, or indeed I'm seeking authorisation, your comments on, becoming delegated explicitly to officers. There are a number of projects which that process would apply to. Fundamentally, projects based around the GCP programme, where they have outlined their intention to use the Transport and Works Act process. We recognise there is a great deal of comment locally on those programmes and projects, and hence we're not seeking officer delegation on the council's position. We're seeking officer delegation to allow the process after the council has determined its position to be dealt with by officers. Moving on, the national strategic infrastructure projects process has 6 stages to it, and these are set out in the report. They obviously follow a logical sequence. And again, those areas in yellow are those elements which form the cornerstone of the council's case, in my view, and which are not we are also not seeking delegation of. The elements at the pre-application acceptance stage and pre-examination stages are those matters that the ones that aren't coloured in that we would be seeking again member agreement to, identified at 4.2.0 in the committee agenda. Continuing through onto the second page, clearly the most significant part of the DCO process is the preparation and submission of what's called the local impact report, which is akin to what you would probably see as your planning off the committee report that explores the issues associated with the development. That is also not an area that we're seeking delegation of as part of the process. We are aware 2 potential projects falling through that process. The Cambridge Wastewater Treatment Works relocation, which we're anticipating potentially at the end of this year, and depending on where we get to with national funding provisions, potentially East West Wales project as well. The A428 Ambourne to Black Cat scheme was a scheme, it probably wouldn't be on your, as part of your consciousness, but that scheme was also previously submitted through the NSIP DCO process. So to try and clarify the recommendation that I'm putting before you, which is on in the papers, and just perhaps to make it a little bit clearer, effectively trying to provide clarity of the delegations, which are set out in the paragraphs there, 420 and 421, and the projects, which are defined in paragraphs 4.4 and 4.12. And as the report highlights, what we would expect to try and expect to do for your next meeting is, against all of those projects listed, bring a report giving you an update on them. Some of you will be familiar through your membership of GCP and others and the assembly of elements of them, but to allow you to surface concerns and comments to help me and my team as we would and exercise such delegation in our engagement with the GCP and those other sponsors through the processes that are not likely to come in front of this committee for consideration. So that's the recommendation. The South Cambridgeshire District Council we've followed a similar process there, and their cabinet has confirmed effectively similar delegations on the same threads. South Cambridge District Council also retaining its decision-making responsibilities through members for those elements that I've listed in yellow on the presentation and are outlined in 4.17 and 4.18 of the report. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just say, these are new voices from the agenda.
Yes, sorry. If it's not clear from my report, there is an issue about speed and timeliness, and I have had discussions with a couple of you. The practical implications of trying to seek an urgent member decision process, whilst they provide for inclusion of democratic input, in the heat of a public inquiry, are effectively impractical and, if we're not careful, actually risk the council not being able to make any representations with the appropriate authority into what are going to be some very important projects affecting the city. Thank you.
We now move on to member questions. I've asked you to raise your hand and press your microphone when you're asked to speak. So I've got Councillor Bick first and then Councillor Herbert.
Thanks, Chair. I was amongst those who called this item in for discussion, and I did so because the references in the delegation are to schemes that some people have very strong feelings about, and probably on all or both sides of the questions. And I definitely didn't want the council to leave our officers at risk of being exposed in taking positions which didn't apparently have the authority of elected members. And I think it's an important principle that if we go ahead and do what's recommended here, that we're doing so in the middle of an exposure of exactly what is being delegated and what is not being delegated and in what environment that is happening. Now, I concede that the process of taking urgent decisions at each of the stages that have been shown on the slide is a time-consuming affair and sucks energy maybe away from other things. But I think if we're going to find a better way of doing this, then we just need to create the right conditions for that to happen. So the things that are being proposed to be delegated are clearly not all of the council's interactions in relation to any of these projects. And it's only in relation to the projects that have been listed, not in relation to any other projects that come along in the future. And that is good. In relation to the stages of those given projects where we would be making a delegation, for me it would be necessary to believe that they were of a primarily bureaucratic nature, or that they were steps that could be discharged under a sort of in an environment in which the council had already given some sort of steer about its position on the given scheme. I recognise that when we talk about a purely bureaucratic stage, what is purely bureaucratic can sometimes be a different thing dependent on your position on the direction of a scheme in total. So I'd like Stephen to comment on the notion that these stages that are being proposed to be delegated are mainly bureaucratic, and just to understand how he would use that word bureaucratic or administrative. And also to say that this would work much better if we had a discussion in this committee on all of these schemes in the round, just so that there was some general pooling of opinion, highlighting of sensitivities, which officers could take away and use when they were applying the delegations. And I think it's a shame at this stage that looking down that list, I'm not sure that we can really say that all of those schemes, maybe even any of those schemes, have had that treatment specifically. And it's not, because we're talking about transport and infrastructure projects, we aren't necessarily talking about initiatives which we already have planning policies that give us all the answers. I think that we are being asked to respond to what other organisations are doing here, and some of that needs a fresh opinion. So I'm quite well disposed to the delegations, but I would like to ask that we get, before any of the delegations are applied, the sort of brief report which enables us to express an opinion on a scheme in the round, which then officers can take away and can know when they're exercising these stages they've been delegated to handle, that they are doing so within the grain of what the council believes and wants.
Yeah, I'm going to take Lewis, Councillor Herbert next. Are you on a similar lines, Councillor Herbert? Are you going to be raising issues along similar lines or on different lines?
I think there's a value in taking me and then responding.
There was always value in taking you, Councillor Herbert, yes.
Well, I hope Councillor Bick agrees after I've completed. So I think there's sort of several layers to this. I mean, the first layer is that on none of these projects, by the nature of the process, is there a sudden lurch to suddenly come up with a different scheme. So both of the NSIPs and also the work by the GCP on other projects, on none of that do those processes suddenly permit a sudden new development. So I think there will be continuing debate from people who take a different view all along. The input from officers isn't going to be earth-shattering in the sense that it isn't a freedom of movement like so I think that's one reassurance. The second is that without minimising some of the impacts in Cambridge, some of the bigger impacts are in South Cambridgeshire overall. I'm not minimising North East Cambridge because clearly that's major. The fact that we've got people in this, including in this chamber, certainly on the GCP projects, doesn't mean that all shades of opinion are represented, but there is a connection from members. So my overall view is that this is necessary and it would be predicated on there being transparency in the minor stuff being necessarily reported, but there being a clear method of report to members of the committee. So I can take that on trust rather than having a recommendation, but I would just seek there to be clarity on that. My additional point, because I think it did arise on an occasion, is that there is an overlap with other parts of the planning service, which concerns me only if there's a breakdown in internal communication within the planning service. And I would also just underline that point because there does need to be a consistency of approach so that if there are other planning applications which are linked, or there are random planning applications where they've got perfect right to submit a planning application, but if our planning service doesn't pick up the potential to sort of hit or affect these other processes, we have a problem, Houston. So I just raised that, but I fully support the principle of Councillor Bick's request, which is that there's a kind of no surprises. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Herbert. Councillor Scott.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to endorse what Councillors Herbert and Bick have said. I think that it's natural to be concerned when it comes to delegation of authority, and it's extremely important to make sure that if there is delegation of authority, it's done in a way that addresses concerns, for example, that the public might have, that people out there in Cambridge might have. So I did want to ask, Chair, if it is contemplated that there would be checks and balances introduced to the process that you could outline very clearly to us all so that we could see that this issue of delegation would be carried out in a way that we could all feel secure that it would be done in a way where, as Councillor Herbert said, we wouldn't be caught on the hop, or we wouldn't be in a position of being surprised when a delegated decision was made. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chair. I endorse the comments that have been made about transparency and accountability, and I have one question for Officer Kelly, which is, it seems to me like the motivation for this change is the combination of the large number of important projects which are coming through at the same time, and the extreme pressure on officer resource. And I just wonder, would we be going down this path if either of those were different? Because it seems to me there's something kind of emblematic about what's being asked for today, about the wider pressure that this area is under at the moment in terms of how thinly spread our officer resource is.
Before I bring in Officer Kelly, I will just make a few remarks in response to that. I think the first, sorry, Martin, I didn't see. Councillor Smart, you want to go?
Right, so it's not a very easy paper to read for members of the public, although I'm very keen on plain English, but I couldn't criticise Stephen Kelly for the paper completely on that. It's pretty, if you read it a few times, it's pretty straightforward, but it is concerning big items, and that's not something that members of the public read about a lot. So I'll just say that to start off with. I think it's been touched on already, but having two authorities and a joint planning service, of which Stephen Kelly is joint head, is a thing. We have it, and I noted that it was really slip of the tongue, but Stephen Kelly referred to South Cambs as we, though of course he is the head of our planning service as well. Although I know the way that it sort of works in a convoluted way is that South Cambs pay his salary, but he's our head too. And I suppose it sort of leads to the question eventually about what happens, Stephen, if you come to the conclusion that on one of these or more than one of these items that South Cambs have a different view to Cambridge, and how do you approach that as the person that's delegated to make a decision on something? So, we've, generally speaking, we seem to get on pretty well with South Cambs. There has been an issue recently with the 4-day working week, to be frank, and issues can arise between even best friends, so it could happen. But on these items, hopefully because they are big infrastructure projects that would benefit all of the people concerned, both authorities, then there shouldn't be an issue. But I just think it's worth raising that to be sure going forward that we have a clear path.
So I just want to make some overarching comments before I ask Stephen Kelly to come in and respond to specific questions. And I just want to refer to Councillor Bick's substantive comments. So the first thing is that this is a delegation of specific projects only. It's not an overarching delegation for all future strategically significant infrastructure projects that will come ahead. We're absolutely clearly agreed on that. The other point, the focus is on a bureaucratic nature. And I think this picks up on Councillor Davies' point as well. It's more, obviously there's a high volume of work to be done here, and it's fairly unpredictable when it's going to come into the system. But actually the timelines when a process starts are actually the windows are quite narrow, and the consultation times and the response times are quite heavily confined. So it's the boundaries of the process and the timetable, I think, Councillor Davies. This is the substantive point this is not an issue of a resource specifically to this, although of course we do overall have a problem with our resource. And then the last point was about where members have been able to give a steer. And I think that what we've done in discussion, in the evolution of this report, is to basically set up as best we can a framework for which members will be able to give officers a steer and bound the scope of their power of delegation. So I just want to reassure you that that's what we've been trying to do here. The first point is that there will be a briefing on the National Strategic Infrastructure Projects and Transport Work Act processes and procedures, including the environmental impact assessment regulations, and including the Council's approach to scoping those environmental impact assessments for major infrastructure projects. So we'll know we'll be well briefed on what the officers are going to be dealing with. At the next meeting of this committee will be a briefing on overview of the projects, so members can express their views to officers, so they can consider that when they're making representations specifically in relation to mitigation of impacts and potential planning obligations and conditions, and which the councils will have responsibility for the discharge of those conditions under these legal procedures. And the last point was that when it comes to commenting on the statement of community involvement and what they've done, the applicants have done, we've asked for an update to the adopted statement of community involvement, which will basically help us to refresh the consultation engagement expectations. So again, that will provide a very clear framework for the officers to operate in, which has actually had member involvement, engagement, and discussion over. The other thing that Stephen Kelly highlighted within his presentation was that at each of the critical stages, so for example, are we opposing, are we supporting that kind of direction, those decisions will be referred to the executive councillor, who will in turn consult with the lead officers. That's correct, isn't it, Councillor Thornborough? So within this delegation, we're working, I think, as you made quite clear, Councillor Blick and Councillor Herbert, to make sure that we do have a firm direction on what's going to happen with these schemes. So I hope that gives the committee reassurance that we're on the same page broadly, and that but at the same time, we're giving the officers the flexibility to work within the procedural programmes and proceeding timetables and so on. So, Stephen, if you want to.
Thank you. Yes, and just following on from those comments, the elements of which I'm seeking delegation, which are listed in the report, they are bureaucratic. Some of them relate to timetabling and issues about witnesses and so on. But they are also about translating the council's view, which is not a delegated matter, in the very same way that we translate a planning committee's view into detailed technical submissions in respect of evidence. And that process, whether it's a planning appeal or indeed in these circumstances, me and my officers are obviously looking together with our barrister in normal circumstances at making the strongest case possible for the delivery of the council's objectives. I hope, notwithstanding Councillor Smart's picking me up on the slip of my tongue, but a good case in point, and you should seek reassurance, was from the way in which me and my officers approached the matter of Cambridge South Station, in which, in relatively short order, but involving a very substantial amount of work, but with officers from both this council and the Shared Planning Service, and indeed from South Cams, and with both South Cams and city members, we were able to mount a very effective campaign that substantially increased biodiversity net gain through that project by tactically, and with delegation to me, objecting and then not objecting to the development consent order process and having a very, very rigorous programme of discussion around the planning conditions and the enforcement process and the Section 106 agreement. And it's essentially on that basis an anticipation of a very live exchange. Cambridge South Station, by and large, received widespread support. Some of our other projects are not necessarily going to be quite as straightforward as people have alluded to. But we obviously understand, and we have seen very clearly the range of views. And as Councillor Herbert, I think, has identified, a number of the projects that I've listed are already widely debated, and a number of views are being put forward to. And the DCO process and the Transport and Works Act process is one with a very fixed set of parameters. So once the council forms its view on the proposal does not dramatically change. The alignment of any of these corridors would not dramatically change. And so I would hope that you would feel assurance that the whole officer team that's engaged with that, from officers across the City Council and the Shared Planning Service and the Shared Legal Service, we would be able to effectively represent you. But it would be wrong for me to say they were totally bureaucratic exercises. They are the application of of the council's, your individual comments in a tactical and effective manner, in as effective manner we can put forwards. In terms of the other comments, I think by and large, hopefully, they have been covered. I recognise that there is potential for the two authorities that I report to having a different view. In those circumstances, we would report the view of the authority. It is the authority's view that is the response to the consultation, and me and my team's role is to effectively represent your position in the best way that we can, as we do when we make recommendations at Planning Committee and the Planning Committee reaches an alternative position upon that. So I wouldn't expect, and it would be inappropriate entirely for me and my team to seek to undermine or in any way diminish a decision made by either council in these circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions anybody wants to raise? And before I go take it to the vote, Councillor Pora.
Thank you, Chair. I just, like everyone, I'm broadly supportive. And I understand, in effect, a lot of this is doing what is already happening for planning in the Joint Development Committee, where there's a clear steer and the officers kind of get on with the background work that needs to happen. I suppose my concern at the moment, which I think has been raised by others, is we're doing it slightly the wrong way around. We're giving the delegation before we've debated the particular 2 or 3 issues that are going to come up. So I suppose first thing I'd ask Stephen is, when will we get a chance to look at these upcoming ones, particularly the ones that are coming up in the next few months? You know, will that be in time for I think January's next meeting of Planning and Transport, if I remember rightly? And obviously, if we do have a briefing, I'd assume it would be a debate rather than a briefing, because obviously we want it to be open to public scrutiny. We want people to see what we're saying. I'd also like just to check paragraph 4.16, where the officer, Stephen, mentions obviously you would continue to work with, you say the lead member, do you mean spokes as well as just the exec councillor? Because I'm obviously mindful that, unlike planning and JDCC, this is obviously a scrutiny committee with different political views represented. And I think, it's important for democracy, but it's also important for the officers to feel that when they take these delegations forward, they, it has been subject to a fair debate. So I'd just be grateful if you could confirm whether that is the lead member and spokes. I think that's the intention, but I'd be grateful. And again, I think the other thing that would be really useful is when officers are undertaking a delegation, it would be useful just to make sure members know, because obviously we may get questions from people, and I think it's important that people know that we're aware of what's going on and we don't just find out several weeks later something's gone off. So I think really some kind of time scale, so that it would be saying, for example, this month we're planning to do X, Y and Z, just so we're aware, because again, it is about making our residents confident that we know what's going on. And I think that would benefit officers as well when this process is scrutinised as it rightly should be. Yes, so I think that's my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. In terms of a debate about the schemes, you run into a risk here of predetermination. So the reason I've brought this report to you is that in some respects, we don't know what the scheme is until it's submitted, and then the clock starts running very quickly. We can certainly, and absolutely our intention is to bring an overview of the scheme and to allow and capture the kind of current views, comments, thoughts, impressions of that scheme based upon the information that we have in front of us at this moment in time. But that information is very considerably short of the amount of information that we will have when the formal applications are submitted. There will be hundreds of pages of documentation that, in some respects, if we're to do the job properly, we need to review and bring to you for consideration on the specifics of the project. If we try and form a view ahead of that, then it would be a bit like trying to determine planning applications based on the pre-app, and that would be wrong. So we have what we believe is a timetable. Indeed, the GCP, who met here in this room last week, have a progress report that outlines what they believe their timetable to be. And a number of those schemes, as you'll have noticed if you followed last week's meeting, are some way into the future. Some of them, still a number of months away. So we absolutely will bring you what we understand to be the programme timetable and the details of the scheme that we have, but it would be wrong to predetermine your position on those. But absolutely, very keen to capture the impact. In terms of the information that members receive about the progression of these projects, as part of the shared planning service, we are already considering how we can provide a much fuller, in a sense, backward-looking newsletter that says what's happened, but also forward-looking at the same time about what is going to happen in terms of the work of the team. And that's a piece of work that we're going on. And just to confirm, as we've tried to do with previous major infrastructure projects, we will seek to engage with the lead member and opposition and spokes. I think we need to be alive to the fact, though, that in certain circumstances, the planning inspector may well require us to express a position the following day, or indeed at a meeting, and there are practical considerations which limit, in some respects, what we can do in some of these circumstances. But we intend it to be an inclusive process as we possibly can.
Is there anything else?
I'd just like to welcome the responses, really. And I mean, I think it would be a surprise if we hadn't had similar objectives as members across the chamber, really, here on this committee. I just, for me, the missing piece that Stephen Kelly has supplied and underlined for us is the commitment to give us the overviews in committee so that we can express opinions. And I just wonder, there's no amendment or anything, can we make sure that is accurately minuted?
Yes.
Because I think it's a very important aspect of the decision we're being asked to take.
It's in the report, and I said in my overview commentary that it will be at the next meeting. and we're going to ask Stephen Kelly to give us a programme of these schemes coming up through the committees as they approach. There's no point in doing ones that's just further down the GCP timetable next time. So we'll get a programme and we'll get that out to you to reassure you on that.
So Chair, I'm not doubting that that is the case, but I just say I think it would be logical and helpful to make sure that that particular feature is recorded in the minutes, because that will then sort of give us the decision in the round, I think.
Consider it done. Thank you. Councillor Smart.
Chair, I'm not quite clear on the response I got from Stephen Kelly. I feel it's my duty to be clear. After all, I'm only really a member of the public sitting here and Stephen's the expert. But when you said, Stephen, about the authority, I mean, there are two authorities, aren't there, concerned? And my question was about, what about if there's some sort of difference of opinion between those two authorities, albeit potentially small? And how does that... I wasn't quite clear whether you were saying that you would be presenting 2 points of view for the two authorities, or whether somehow, I thought this would be the answer, but I'm not clear, that somehow you would get the two authorities to agree on a point of view by going through the Executive Council's concern. So, for example, with the Greater Greenways project, which I'm very keen on as lead councillor for cycling, I know a little bit about, but not that much. I'd be keen for those to be done as soon as possible. We should be getting people cycling into the city from the villages as soon as possible, and that would be my point of view, and possibly the city's point of view, I don't know. But maybe South Cambs' point of view might be a bit slower, because they might want to consult their residents more because the routes go through South Cambs, etc., etc. So I might be talking rubbish there, but that could be a difference. And I'm just wondering if any differences like that could be a problem, and how would they be resolved? Through you, Chair.
I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. Because the stages, there are a couple of really important stages that are not delegated, and those stages are the determination of the council's position, and both councils will have to go through that process and determine their position. And so, my job is not to try and get the councils into one place. That isn't. If the councils have a very clear position, my job and my team's job is to represent that position as firmly and clearly as we can. And so please, don't feel that I'm going to try and soften a Cambridge City position in order to try and bring it closer to a potentially different position of South Cambs. The legal obligation, the consultation, the role of each council in the Development Consent Order or the Transport and Works Act process is to report its position. And what I'm trying to do here is to identify a process to allow me to report the position. In the case of Cambridge South Station, we reported 2 positions. They were aligned, but they were distinct and they were separate. And that is what we will do with all of these projects. So my job is not to kind of blend them. My job is to obviously try and explore those areas where there is common ground. But if the councils reach diametrically opposite positions, then we will put diametrically opposite positions into the examination process. We're ultimately not the decision maker. And so in this case, our job is to report and to represent rather than to determine. And there is therefore no need for arbitration in quite that way.
I just wanted to, the example about South Cambridge Station is a good example, because the Executive for Open Space also made a comment about the application with regard to biodiversity. And we did as well, because of the park there, and the Cambridge City comments were amended to take on all of those comments and feelings, and actually it was presented at the Environment and Community Scrutiny Committee as well, because of their comments, so that it was scrutinised there as well as in this committee.
Councillor Kelly.
Sorry, the chair's just asked me to clarify. Depending upon the particular project, the local authority, if it's in the area, has a slightly different status to an adjacent local authority. Now, I don't know the full extent of the development consent order or TWA proposals because we haven't got those. But it may well be a circumstance in which the City Council is not automatically ascribed interested party status by the legislation and would need to seek that. But in all other respects, effectively, you know, that both authorities in my team and my view will be given equal standing in their representations.
So I'm now going to invite the vote on the recommendation. The recommendation is the Executive Council has recommended to delegate to the Joint Director of Planning and Economic Development authority for providing responses on behalf of the City Council to the stages of the statutory process listed in para 420 and 421 for the infrastructure proposals listed in paras 4.4 and 4.121, sorry, 4.12 below. All those in favour, please raise your hand. That's unanimous. Is the Executive Council minded to agree the recommendation?
Yeah, thank you for the recommendation, and thank you for all of you taking time to go through this so carefully. I completely agree that transparency in all planning matters is a top priority, and your scrutiny on this and your comments, Chair, really appreciated.
Thank you, Councillor Thornber, and thank you also, Stephen, for your presentation and your very eloquent responses to Councillor's searching questions. So thank you, it's really appreciated. Excellent. It's been a very good process what we've been through on this. I'm going to turn now to items 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. Do any councillors wish to raise any points on these items, bearing in mind the decisions have already been made? Okay, so I propose that I ask members to note the decisions en bloc. Yeah, do that. And so that's it on that particular point. This is as process as we get. So thank you. That concludes the Planning and Transport Scrutiny Committee. Please could I ask everyone to clear away their rubbish. Thank you for everybody who's taken part and participated in this, and thank you, Councillor Scutt, for coming online to watch the proceedings. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.